So these next 3 weeks, including this morning, we have really the heart of the Great Awakening. The Wesleys, Jonathan Edwards, and George Whitefield. And in particular this morning, that we are going to talk in some detail about John and Charles Wesley. Really want to focus on their mother, Susanna, maiden name, Annesley Wesley. But we'll start and back our way to her story by saying a little bit about her two most famous children, John and Charles. And once you hear about them, and then we learn about her, you'll see how much of her is in her children. Before 1729, as far as we know, the word Methodist did not exist in reference to a certain kind of Christian. How many of you at some point grew up, were Methodist? I'm not going to ask you if you still are. I'm going to trust that you have those good things. Some books. This is a little book by Arnold Dallimore. He was a Baptist pastor and wrote the second half of the 20th century, self-taught historian, but wrote a lot of nice, well-researched books. He wrote 2 volumes on Whitefield, he wrote on Spurgeon, and then this just a little book, which I've drawn heavily from, about Susannah Wesley. And if you want some books about John and Charles, this whole series, Classics of Western Spirituality, has an easily accessible paperbacks. We'll sometimes have good primary sources. So this is one that has some of the writings of Charles and John Wesley and a brief introduction and biography. And there's lots and lots, as you can imagine, about the Wesleys. This is from maybe 30 years ago, Kenneth Collins, A Real Christian, The Life of John Wesley. And then a very well-written book that came out for the 300th anniversary of John's birth, which was 1703, John Wesley, a biography. This is published by Erdman's. It's very good read. It is a bit jaundiced, I think, towards Wesley, and we're going to talk frankly about some of his strengths and some of his weaknesses. So there's a few books. But before 1729, no one used the word Methodist to describe a Christian. As we've seen with so many of these terms, it started out as an insult. John and his brother Charles had already completed their studies at Oxford, but they were called back to Oxford, and with 2 others, they started the Holy Club. Now, they meant well with that title, but you can see if you give yourself that title, the Holy Club, you are inviting some unholy people to not like the name of your club. What did they do in this Holy Club? They fasted twice a week. They visited prisoners, taught them to read, sometimes paid their debts, helped find them work. They did work among the poor. They distributed food, clothes, medicine, books. They studied. And they were called Methodists, along with some not as nice epithets, because of their intense, punctilious, methodistical devotion and study. So this Holy Club, started by John and Charles, and they move to Georgia for a time. So this is Oxford, John and Charles, 1729, and it disbands when John and Charles leave in 1735. John's father, who we'll hear much more about in a bit, died in 1735, and he was an Anglican pastor in most of his time. Most famously was in Epworth, and there their home, the rectory, the rector, the pastor. When his father died, Samuel, he wanted John, or John's older brother, Samuel, to take over because they were both ordained in the Church of England. But John refused, and John and Charles instead went from England to the New World at the beck and call of Colonel James Oglethorpe, governor of the Georgia colony and ministers, he said, were needed to care for the spiritual needs of the colonists and to evangelize the native people. And so they went to Savannah. That's where I was last week speaking at a conference and at Independent Presbyterian Church there for Terry Johnson in the morning. And there are, a memorial there for the work, briefly, that John and Charles did sailing from England to Savannah. They weren't there very long because they fled Georgia in December 1737, and I'll give you the reason why they left Georgia so quickly in just a moment. Well, on their way, on the boat, the long journey, they were impressed, John and Charles, by a group of Moravians. We don't have time to talk about the Moravians, but they were in some ways at the forefront. Now, they were extreme Moravians that threw some of the movement into disrepute, but at its best, they had hymns, they had missions, they were early evangelicals, these German Moravians. And they were impressed by these Moravians on the boat. They seemed to have a peace with God. And when the boat was storm-tossed, the Moravians didn't have the same panic. And so the Wesleys were very impressed with these Moravians. And on their way back to England, John met another Moravian named Peter Bowler, Bohler, who impressed upon him the central importance of faith. So while reading Luther's commentary on Galatians, it's amazing how often Luther still, we're 150 years later, that Luther is still so instrumental. Wesley gained a better grasp of justification by faith. And then in a space of a few days, John and Charles were converted, or at least this is what they understood to be their conversion in 1738. First, Charles was converted, May 21, 1738, found this new peace with God, and then famously it was John's turn during a service in Aldersgate Street on May 24, 1738, while the commentary of Romans. So Luther's commentary to Galatians was instrumental. Now Luther's commentary to Romans was being read. And famously, Wesley's heart was strangely warmed. He was 35 years old. For the rest of his life, he preached the good news of salvation by faith wherever he could. Many of the pulpits in England were closed to him, that is, in the Church of England, because they thought he was this kind of catch-all term that exists throughout the 18th century, an enthusiast. This was generally not a good thing. We might say a charismatic, though not with all of that theology, but an enthusiast. So he was often driven to preach in the fields and in the homes and to start his own chapels. He organized bands, B-A-N-D-S, groups for the same sex where members were expected to share intimate details of their lives, hold each other accountable. Just think of a small group, a covenant group. Well, this had some roots in the German pietists, but these sorts of things that we take for granted were in many ways pioneered by Wesley and the Methodists. He was essentially an itinerant preacher who organized disciples into societies. He drew up rules of discipline and organization, and at the end of his life, crossing the Rubicon, as it were, because he was still in the Church of England, and he and Charles fancied themselves, we are not starting something new, we just want to reform the Church of England, and yet John got frustrated at the end of his life, and he started ordaining men himself. He was not a bishop, he did not have authority to do so. Charles disagreed with John doing so. John and Charles didn't always agree on things. Hard to imagine that brothers don't always agree, but they didn't. And that was the step really where, despite everything that John said about being committed to the Church of England, really set them off to be something different. When John Wesley died, and I promise we'll get to Susanna about a third of the way through here. When John Wesley died on March 2, 1790. So John, think about this. Almost everyone we've looked at this so far in the class was in their 50s, 40s. He lived 87. He had a very long life, especially for the 18th century, 1703 to 1790. There were nearly 300 Methodist preachers in Britain, over 70,000 Methodists in Britain, and another 60,000 in America. So think of that. In the space of, maybe the Holy Club to 1790, now there are over 130,000 Methodists. John famously traveled 250,000 miles on horseback. 250,000. I hope to not drive that many or fly that many. I probably will fly, but 250,000 miles on horseback. Estimated that he preached 40,000 sermons. He gave away more than 30,000 pounds, which would be probably about 60 years of a very nice salary. He had written more than 200 books. Charles, you may know Charles is more famous as the hymn writer. When Charles died, he had published 4,500 hymns. I'd like to write a hymn someday. And he left another 3,000 poems in manuscript form. And many of our most beloved hymns are from Charles Wesley. Christ the Lord is risen today. And can it be? Hark the herald. Rejoice the Lord is king. Jesus, lover of my soul. We could go on and on. The output from John and Charles was truly astounding. Now, we should say that John's theology was self-consciously Arminian. And we'll say more about that when we come to George Whitefield in a couple of weeks, because Whitefield was also a Methodist. He was a Calvinistic Methodist. And they, though friendly, split over the doctrines of grace. At one point, John said, "We stand on the edge of Calvinism." George Whitefield wanted to push him over that edge, but he wasn't pushed over that edge. And they believed in justification by faith, but Wesley did not believe in this exact same doctrine. He was skeptical of the imputation of faith and often wrote against those who defended imputation, or rather imputation of righteousness by faith. He also, though he talked lavishly about grace, it was a belief in a prevenient grace. So you maybe heard me say, well, I said it in the Canons of Dort class last year, it's a bit of a downer for us as Calvinists, but almost certainly Charles Wesley's hymn, And Can It Be, which he wrote soon after this conversion, is in large part about prevenient grace. We take it to be sovereign grace breaking through in our understanding, and it certainly can read it that way, but he was probably talking about the prevenient grace that comes to all. Wesley's most distinctive doctrinal contribution was his theology of perfection. And in this book, it has his, at the very end, it has his treatise on Christian perfection. Well, what is Christian perfection? Here's just one quote. A Christian is so far perfect as not to commit sin. This is the glorious privilege of even Christian, yea, though he be but a babe in Christ. But it is only of grown Christians that it can be affirmed they are such a sense perfect, and secondly, to be free from evil thoughts and evil tempers. He believed in sanctification would not set you free from mistakes or errors. It would not set you free from temptation, but that the goal was to have an awareness of your perfection, to be free from evil thoughts and evil tempers. A beloved Charles Wesley hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, which whenever I sing, I take to mean that perfect love we will have at the end of the age, but Charles wrote that as a hymn of perfection in this life. The genius of John Wesley was his organization. Yes, he was a good preacher, but he couldn't hold a candle to George Whitefield as a preacher. But Whitefield was no organizer. There was a reason that Calvinistic Methodists, They hardly exist anymore. The one place where they did have a foothold was in Wales, because there were men there to take that preaching of Whitefield and turn it into something of an organization. And the most famous person who grew up in a Calvinistic Methodist household that you may have heard of is Martin Lloyd-Jones. But Whitefield was not the organizer. Wesley was. He had a genius for organizing. He had an energy and a force of personality. He was generally blessed with good health. Almost everyone we've seen were constantly sickly, and gout and hemorrhoids, and just everything nasty. And he got sick too. Everyone did. But he lived 87 years. He was absolutely fastidious about what he ate. He was short. He was shorter than 5'4", and it's said that he weighed 128 pounds his entire adult life. You could throw this man somewhere. He insisted that Methodist clergy concern themselves with the poor, and Wesley himself, as I said, gave away vast sums of money. He was concerned that ordinary people be able to hear the gospel. He preached conversion, faith, sincere devotion, and holy living. Now, before we turn to Susanna, because this will help us understand in retrospect something about the Wesley family. The Wesley family was interesting. They were volatile, eccentric, filled with suffering, tragedy, impressive, and confusing all at the same time. And John, even the admirers of John Wesley today have to admit he had one, and we all have many weaknesses, but in particular, John had one glaring weakness. Okay, he could be proud and prickly. Many people are. He started ordaining men, as I said, first in America, then in Scotland, then in England. Charles disagreed with it. John started taking the name bishop for himself, but then when Francis Asbury took the name bishop, John didn't like that very much. So all of that. He could be thin-skinned, but his worst trait, as everyone agrees, was his many failed relationships with women. Just mention the four most famous, infamous. First, this woman, Sally Kirkham. John visited her in her home. This is when he's a young man in his early 20s. They danced together, they played games together, they read books, they discussed theology, they were flirtatious, but John never proposed. And so this is 1720s. John never proposed, and she ended up marrying another man, John Chapone. John, however, continued to write her. Now, to be fair, this was not unheard of in the 18th century that people would continue writing correspondence, men to women, even after they were married. Doesn't seem like a good idea to me, but they did it. But what was unheard of is they continued to have a flirtatious relationship even after she was married. There are records in letters, so forth, of them holding hands, of John laying his head on her breast, of professing love to one another. At one point, Sally tells John, "I love you more than all men except my father and my husband." Well, I guess that's okay. They continued to write and elicited a rebuke from good old mom. Said, "Cut it out, John. She's married." And this was an embarrassment. Eventually, it fell away. So that was the first, writing and continuing a flirtatious relationship with a woman after she's married. Even worse, perhaps, is this second woman, Sophia Hopke. Remember I said John went to Savannah. And when he was in Savannah, he met this young woman, Sophia. John was sick. She cared for him. John was utterly smitten. John wanted to marry her, so now we're in the 1730s. He wanted to marry her, but John had committed in his heart that he was going to be celibate. He was going to be single for the Lord, and he was going to serve the Lord's cause by never getting married. They spent all sorts of time together, but again, they loved each other and he couldn't pull the trigger. Right, men? Maybe there's a lesson. He didn't propose. And in time, sort of similar, she got engaged to another man. Well, now she cuts off the French lessons that John was teaching her, and John is she tells John about this engagement. And John was heartbroken, and again, he responds very poorly. He turns bitter. And he, being the pastor among these colonists in Georgia, bars Sophia from the Lord's table. Says she's not been very fastidious in her church attendance. She's not fasting enough. It was very thinly disguised jealousy and bitterness. And to make matters worse, Sophia's uncle was the lead magistrate of the colony in Savannah, who did not look too kindly upon John humiliating and mistreating his niece. So when all of this broke, John lost all favor with the colonists in Savannah, and that's why he and Charles had to quickly flee back to England. Sophia Hopkey. A third woman, Grace Murray. Now we are in the 1740s. John, again, sick for a time, is nursed back to health by this woman, Grace Murray. She was a Methodist class leader, an orphan housekeeper. She was a dynamic spiritual presence herself. They fell in love. He proposed. They were engaged in the summer of 1748. You say, this is finally going to be the match that works. Alas, several months earlier, Grace had also developed feelings for another man who happened to be John's best friend, a minister named John Bennet. Well, Grace admits to John Wesley, now her fiancé, that she has developed some feelings for John Bennet. And John Wesley says, well, you need to decide, which John is it? Well, she says, it's you. You're my fiancé. I love you, but this isn't quite enough for John. He's not sure about it. He wants her to prove her love, and so he puts things on pause. Meanwhile, Charles, John Wesley's brother, who never wanted his brother to marry, I don't know if he thought it would be a detriment to the ministry, but he actually urges Grace, you should marry John Bennet, which she does. So John Wesley, you can understand, feels absolutely betrayed. This is my fiancé who married my best friend, who's also an Anglican minister, and at the instigation of my brother Charles. And like he had done with Sophia, now he starts attacking this man John Bennet, thinly veiled theological language. It was really all about his own hurt. Most people think that John should have married Grace Murray. They would have had a happy marriage. They would have done ministry together. One of the rather sad curiosities, though, is John and Grace had agreed that when they were married, if they had children, all of their children would be raised at a boarding house to set them free to do ministry and to travel. So finally, he marries a woman, Mary. She went by they called her Molly Vaziel. Finally, now we are in the 1750s. He marries Molly. After 3 failed relationships with women he loved, he made the very tragic mistake of marrying a woman he didn't love. He married a wealthy widow, Molly. She had means. She had some children from the previous marriage, but she was past the age of childbearing. So, okay, in John's mind, this was good. She has money. We're not going to have children. At first, their marriage seemed fairly happy, but John was gone all the time. This led to resentment, and soon there was a great chill between the two of them. Also, Molly, she had permission while John was gone to open his mail, and she noticed, to her surprise, he was writing very intimate letters to all sorts of women. Now, these aren't pornographic letters or anything like that. It's him counseling, talking about spiritual things, but yet there's a level of intimacy that's inappropriate. And one woman in particular, Sarah Ryan, who was a thrice married woman that John had grown close to through pastoral counseling and these letters. Well, Molly is irate. At one point, she finds a letter in Wesley's pocket where Sarah expresses her deep love and affection for John. So they were married in 1751, and already by 1758, she moves out, which will be the first but not the last time. She moves out, she comes back, she moves out, she comes back. You can understand, she felt like this man, my husband, who has no time for me, has enough time to write very thoughtful, pastoral, intimate letters to other women in these Methodist circles. In 1774, after 23 years of a very bad marriage, Molly left John for good. They communicated through letter on and off, often argumentative, accusatory, defensive. When she left, John said, "I did not dismiss her, I will not recall her." Very sad. When Molly died in so never divorced, that would have been unheard of. But when Molly died in 1781, John wasn't even notified immediately that she had died, and he didn't attend her funeral. So everyone acknowledges where John Wesley succeeded as a preacher and a church leader, he objectively failed as a husband. George Whitefield, as we'll see, was not a great husband either. Jonathan Edwards, on the other hand, had a wonderful relationship with his wife, Sarah. John left behind no children of his own. Even among his admirers, they recognized that his relationships with women were a terrible weakness. Now, there's no evidence that he was an adulterer, but he certainly lacked wisdom, propriety, tact, maturity. It was said throughout John's ministry, he could bear the assaults of his enemies with grace. I mean, mobs attacked him, people hated him, and he bore those with great equanimity, but he handled the criticisms of his friends and family with a kind of petty vindictiveness. That's often true for some of us, I bet. People from afar hate us, we can just bear it up, but people close to us. Now you say, well, we have 40 minutes left, or 35. I thought this was about Susanna Wesley. Now it is. But I wanted to start with her son first because obviously one of the reasons we're talking about Susanna is because what John and Charles did. But as you'll see, Susanna is worth studying in her own right, even if she never had a John and Charles to make her famous. I also start with John and Charles because you're going to see some of the family dynamics that unfortunately were in John's life come from, many of the best things about John come from his mother. And some of the bad things come also from the relationship between his mother and father. Now you ask, what about Charles? Well, happily, Charles had a very good marriage. Married a woman, Sarah Gwynn. They had 8 children, 3 survived childhood. When Charles had advised Grace Murray to marry John Bennett, it estranged John and Charles stepped back from leadership in the Methodist societies, and Charles was much more committed to the local parish than to the itinerant ministry. All right, Susanna Wesley. You can see there her maiden name, Ainsley or Annesley. Susanna Wesley was born in 1669 to the Reverend Dr. Samuel Annesley. He was a leading dissenting minister. Remember, Church of England, if you're not a part of the Church of England, then you're called a nonconformist because you're not conforming, or you're a dissenter because you're dissenting from the state church. So that's what we mean. He was a leading dissenting minister. Susanna, born in 1669, was the last of 25 children. There'll be some relief to know that this was through 2 wives, but that relief will be quickly short-lived because the first wife had 1, the second wife had 24. first wife sadly died in childbirth, and the other had 24. And when Susanna was born, they said, Dr. Annesley, I can't remember, he has either 250 or 24 children. That was the 25th. Samuel Annesley was one of thousands of ministers who lost his pulpit during the Great Ejection. Remember that from 2 weeks ago, and maybe Greg talked about it. The Great Ejection of 1662. This is where the Church of England cracks down again, and all of those dissentings, the Puritan ministers, lose their pulpits. Samuel Annesley was very well regarded. He had a very healthy, I never can make the sign for British pounds, but 700 pounds a year. This is going to be important because one of the stories of the Wesley's life is their constant scraping by in indebtedness. But Susanna's dad, when he was ejected during the Great Ejection, lost what some people say was as much as 700 pounds, which we'll see was a very lucrative sum. Years later, when John Wesley is paying his Methodist ministers, he paid them 15 pounds. So just to tell you, this was a very handsome salary, and he lost it because of his convictions. Annesley quickly started up a new ministry when about 10 years later, some of these restrictions were relaxed and the dissenters were once again able to minister. Susanna grew up in this privileged home in a very desirable section of London, and during her childhood, she met many of the leading dissenters, Thomas Manton, Richard Baxter, John Owen. These were the men coming through her house. We don't know how Susanna was educated, maybe a local school, maybe taught by her father, maybe a private tutor, but she was well taught, as we'll see, because she's going to teach her children. She was extremely bright. She was religious inclined from a young age, and later she reflected. Now, you never know when you're thinking about yourself as a child, how much are you imposing your own adult beliefs on your childhood, but at least what she said was when she was young, she purposed never in one day to spend more time in recreation than time in prayer and study of the Word. Just like the DeYoung children, I promise you. She loved to read. She was intent on bettering herself. But before the age of 13, and this is going to tell you something good and strange about Susanna Wesley. So remember I said she grew up in this dissenting family. Her dad was really a big deal, had all these important people come through. Well, for some reason, and we don't quite know why, she became convinced, even before she was 13, that the Church of England was right and the dissenters were wrong. And she left her father's own church and walked to the local Church of England parish and joined the Church of England. She became convinced as a 12-year-old girl that the Church of England was right and the Puritans were wrong. Now, we see in this from a young age, very spiritually precocious, opinionated, independent, fiery, stubborn, all these things. On November 11, 1688, so born there, and 1688, she gets married. She marries Samuel Wesley. There's a lot of Samuels here. Her father was Samuel. She marries Samuel Wesley. Samuel's father had also been a dissenting pastor who was also removed during the Great Ejection, and Samuel also had decided that the Church of England was right. Now, it seems, if this isn't too unfair, that Samuel Wesley probably decided that the Church of England was right because he thought that it was a greater prospect for vocational ministry and for an ambitious young man. You were certainly, not to say he wasn't a real Christian, but you certainly had a better career path if you were in the Church of England. But for whatever reason, in fact, Samuel's father at one point was arrested and died in prison. His father was a martyr for the dissenting cause, and yet Samuel joins the Church of England. When they got married, you can do the math, she's 19, he's 26. Susanna, we are told, was beautiful. with a dignified air, and she was tall. Samuel, like John would be, was short. He was probably not even 5'4", and she was certainly taller than him. After the wedding, Samuel began work as a curate. That's like an associate pastor in the Church of England. By the summer of 1690, they had their first child, a son, they also named Samuel. And famously, from this marriage, they will have a mere 19 children, 10 of whom live out of infancy. So you can find the names of those other children who died in childbirth or died very young. So what we're really talking about, well, they're all their children, of course, but as we know and as they grow up, we're talking about Susanna raising 10 children. Susanna had a remarkable spirit, not only to train her children, but, frankly, to endure her husband. Samuel's career in the Church of England was never what he wanted it to be. He was a good scholar, he was a fine preacher, and he could have moments of tenderness to his flock and to his family, but he was also ambitious, domineering, and he was prone to parade his own sense of self-importance. He could be harsh with his family. He could be unforgiving. As a pastor, he retained this practice, which had mostly gone out of style by this time, that when there was someone who was a notorious sinner in the congregation, in particular someone guilty of adultery, they would wear a sheet and they would come in without shoes and socks, and they would sit in a conspicuous place for consecutive Sundays to do penance. You wonder where Nathaniel Hawthorne got the idea of a scarlet letter. Well, there were these kinds of practices. Here's where the adulterer sits here in church, and everyone can see him or her. Samuel still practiced that. After serving in a few different places, Samuel was eventually appointed to be the rector at Epworth. It's where if you were going on a Wesley pilgrimage tour, you would go to Epworth in the north of England, northeast of Sheffield. The Queen had granted him this career advancement because he had published a book and he had dedicated to her, and he was not beyond flattering people in high positions, and it probably got him this job. So remember, they don't have search committees and listen to your sermons. It's a patron or it's the royalty that puts you in these positions. Well, he was scraping by, and now he's given a living worth 200 pounds. So Samuel or Susanna's father had anywhere from 300 to 400 to initially 700 pounds, but now Samuel Wesley is making 200 pounds, which is still a nice, should be enough money to get by. A big bump from the 50 pounds he had been making. But a theme of their life is Samuel struggled constantly with finances. In 1700, he was so far in debt, he had to write letters to various patrons asking for loans or for gifts, or that if they would forgive the debts he already had. And Samuel is spending less and less time at home. Now, it's hard not to see that John has learned some bad habits from his father. John was gone for weeks at a time. He would go to London for convocation. This is like a church parliament, a series of meetings. And in 1702, things go from bad to worse. This is a bizarre, at least to our ears, story. In 1702, remember I said weeks ago, in 1688, that's the year they're married, is the Glorious Revolution. And this is where William and Mary come to the throne. William of Orange, who is a descendant from the William of Orange we looked at in the Dutch week. This William of Orange, William and Mary. So he's Dutch, and he comes to the Protestant throne, Glorious Revolution. Well, every night they end their prayers, Susanna and Samuel, with a generic and, God bless our King. And Susanna refused to say amen. She didn't think, now this is going to sting just right here to me, she didn't think that someone from the Netherlands could really be the King of England. So she was not happy with this king. Now, probably this happened all the time, that they said their prayers, and she refused to give her amen. But on this night, whether intentionally or in a moment of irrationality, Samuel flips out, and he makes a vow. I refuse to live with you, woman. I will never touch you. I will never sleep in the same bed with you again. I can't be under the same roof with you. He leaves Susanna and the children. Of course, they don't have all this many by this point. Leaves the children because she won't say amen to his prayers. Now, it just boggles your mind. First of all, Susanna, what? Don't you pray for the king? Can't you say amen? But then also Samuel, stop being such a doofus. Why are you leaving? As best as historians can figure, why did Samuel react this way? He left the house. He moved out. He didn't even tell them. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have telegraph. They didn't even know where he went. Maybe one of two reasons. One, he was probably worried that this would embarrass him. Remember, he was always looking for ecclesiastical preferment. He was always looking for the better calling, one that would make more money, help him get out of debt. And if the king and queen find out that his own wife isn't saying amen to the prayers, he might have thought his career was in jeopardy. It's also possible that he simply used this as an excuse to get out of the house when he didn't want to be there. While he was away, the rectory, their home, burned down. First of two times. Come to the second in a bit. A harrowing ordeal. Neighbors had to break in, save one of the crying children who had been left behind. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but they lost everything. When Samuel heard of the fire, he came to his senses. Maybe he thought that was a sufficient excuse to break his vow, and he came home. He was gone, all told, 5 months. But they had to start their marriage over, and Samuel hurt himself in two very profound ways. One, if he thought that somehow he was defending the honor of the king and that this might help his ecclesiastical career, it certainly didn't. Because what did people think? Well, this vicar left his own wife and their house burned down. This meant he was never going to climb any higher than Epworth. It also meant that the relationship with Susanna was never the same. Their marriage continued in a state of coldness, distance. Probably one of the reasons Susanna threw herself so completely into the life of her children. Now, this is hard if you know anything about Susanna Wesley. On the one hand, I wanted to study a mother and a woman, and it's very inspiring. On the other hand, probably any mother here is going to say, well, great, I don't do anything like Susanna Wesley. Well, she was, as one author put it, a benevolent despot. She was a machine. She held classes for her children 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. She did not believe in toys. She said, we do not have any amusements in our home. She did not allow loud talking. She did not give them time for playing. Now, she had some household servants. Most people in her station would have, so there's probably some cooking and cleaning and things, so there you can have some relief. She wasn't doing all that. She was their children's tutor, taskmaster, disciplinarian. Samuel, the father, taught the languages. She did the rest. She was a very strict disciplinarian. Famously or infamously, she said, she taught them from infancy to learn how to cry but very softly, or to make no noise at all. She insisted on immediate total obedience. Her aim was, quote, conquering the will. She said she was intent on saving their souls, which at this time in her life she seemed to equate with living a disciplined life, staying away from worldliness. And if it wasn't enough that 6 days a week she was teaching all of the kids 6 hours a day, she also resolved later in life that she would spend 1 hour in private mentoring with each student across the course of the week, and at sometimes 2 a day. Her diligence is the stuff of legend, and she was undeniably extremely intelligent. In 1704, she wrote her firstborn, who was So 1688, 1704, her firstborn is out of the house. They would leave at an earlier age. Samuel, so also named Samuel, probably her favorite. She begins the letter, "Dear Sammy." Well, that's nice, Sammy. The eternal, so this is writing to Samuel. He's, a teenager? "Dear Sammy, the eternal law with respect to man is called the law of reason. When it is more clearly explained by revelation, it is called divine. When it orders natural agents, which it does willingly, yet constantly and regularly, we style it the law of nature and instinct." Just like every teenage boy wants to hear from his mother. This is what she did. This is how she instructed him. Later in that letter, she's talking about the principles of natural religion. She says, quote, "I shall only hint at those that are most obvious and easy to understand." And then she went on for another 315 lines. No doubt her children received a remarkable education from their mother. And it's really no surprise that John and Charles were dubbed Methodists, because the method they inherited was from their mother. Samuel, for his part, the father, continued to struggle with debt. In 1705, he was even placed in prison for a very small debt he couldn't repay. 1709, the rectory burned down for a second time. Initially, Susanna thought she had lost all the children, but a servant and Samuel, so I want to say something positive about the dad, rushed in and carried several children out. 2 of the children were thrown out the window, and John, whom they would call Jack or Jackie, so he was 5 or 6 at the time. He was in his nursery room, and they thought he was lost, but he made his way to the window, and his father climbed up the outside and rescued him just before the roof caved in. So for the rest of his life, he thought of himself literally as a brand plucked from the fire, that his life had been spared. The house was rebuilt. During this time of upheaval, several of the children were farmed out to family and friends. That makes sense. And by Susanna's estimation, when they went to live with relatives, they picked up bad habits of neglecting church. They learned bad songs. They forgot their manners. They talked, quote, with clownish accents. Not sure what those meant. Those show something of Susanna's ability, but also the fact that when they went to live somewhere else, they, we might say, acted more like children. Probably meant Susanna was able to have them controlled in the way she wanted, and then somewhere else they reverted to, she would say, less reputable, we might say in some ways more normal. In 1712, Samuel was away on church business in London, and the curate, left behind to preach, was so bad that Susanna started reading sermons in the kitchen. And in time, as many as 200 people were gathering to hear Susanna read sermons. Again, if you're from a persuasion, as we would not be, that thinks women preachers or pastors is a great advance, then they would look to something like this and say, well, if only Susanna had known her true calling. Now, for her part, she wouldn't have said she was a pastor. She would say, I'm just reading someone else's sermons because that minister is so bad. But later, John, her son, would give free rein to women to preach. Now, again, these are to his Methodist societies and groups, so he may have had it in his own mind, not quite crossing a line to arguing for ordained ministry, but certainly allowed for more freedom for women. Her husband, away at another convocation, was not happy that his wife was reading sermons in the kitchen, told him to stop. She said no. And then she said, in a letter to him, I'm paraphrasing, if you want me to stop, command me to do so, because then I'll do it and I'll be free of guilt for disobeying. You know, my conscience tells me to do this. You're my husband. If you command me, then I will obey you and I won't be guilty. And Samuel relented and fine, and backed down. The Wesleys were a volatile, passionate, somewhat eccentric family. They were superstitious. They believed with great fervency that a ghost haunted their house. The best rationale or explanation is that one of their daughters was playing tricks on them. They believed in communicating with dead spirits. Their family relationships were constantly strained. Susanna, for example, was furious when her wealthy brother, also named Samuel, lots of Samuels, never came through on his promise to share his fortune with them. He was away in India. He was making a fortune. They patched up their relationship. He said, I'm coming back. Susanna expected a great windfall of support from her wealthy brother, and very strangely, he never got off the boat. It's a mystery. The best guess is someone murdered him as a wealthy individual, threw his body overboard. He never got off the boat when it landed in England. Samuel's brother, the Samuel, Susanna's husband, his brother Matthew was a well-to-do physician. Some of the children went to stay with him when the fire happened, and they constantly wanted help from Matthew. But Matthew, when he got to see the children, said to his brother, what are you raising here? These are squalid conditions. You are not providing for your children. And this prompted Samuel to write a number of sarcastic, defensive letters back and forth to his brother. Throughout Samuel's life, he did work hard. He tried to make ends meet, but he had a lifelong habit of never admitting he was wrong and cutting off people who were critical of him. Again, you can see just a little bit, to a lesser degree, but some of John's. The family of Susanna Wesley, and our time, we have maybe just 10 minutes left, but let me try to give you a rundown of their children. It is a series of unfortunate events. It really is heartbreaking to think about the various trials and tragedies that befell the Wesleys. Quickly, the oldest, so we're going to do 10. The oldest was Samuel. He was ordained in the Church of England. He became a headmaster of a school. He was very generous. He supported his parents financially, and his mother was crushed when Samuel died in 1739. He was in his 40s. That's the first. Second, Amelia was the second child. She resented that her father was gone so often and that he left the family in want and misery. She was especially grieved, several of the daughters felt this way, that he had saved all of this money to send his sons to Oxford. They weren't wealthy, so you had to really scrimp and save to get your kids to Oxford. And she resented, as many of the daughters did, that whatever money they had was spent on the sons. Now, at this time, the daughters couldn't even go to university if they wanted to. They weren't allowed. But sent the sons off to Oxford, and they didn't have enough money to care for the mom and for the girls. Amelia became a teacher at a girls' school. Later, she married, but the marriage was unhappy. And when her husband's business fell on hard times, he took money from Amelia's salary and left her destitute. After her husband died, John, her brother, would provide for her. Third, Susanna. They called this daughter Sukey. That's a cute name, S-U-K-E-Y. Sukey, from an early age, was hoping that this rich uncle would provide for her, but it never came through. And so when that money didn't come, she rashly got married. She, Susanna said, quote, threw herself upon a coarse, vulgar, immoral man, little inferior to the apostate angels in wickedness. She did not approve. The husband, Richard Ellison, was vile and cruel. At one point, he even faked his own funeral just so he could find out where his wife was, because then they were separated and she showed up. Now, at the end of his life, it is said that this vile husband was converted under John's ministry. So Sukey had a very unhappy marriage. The next child was Mary. While she was an infant, she suffered an accident, maimed her for the rest of her life. She was a cripple. She thought she would never get married, but alas, she did. She fell in love with one of the curates at Epworth, and they got married, and sadly, less than a year after their wedding, she died in childbirth. Just one sadness after another, even considering the 18th century. The fifth child, in some ways, is the saddest of all, Mehetabel, whom, thankfully, they called Hetty. Hetty was bright, intelligent, talented, cheerful, beautiful, witty. 27, she fell in love with a school teacher named John Romilly. Hetty's father, so Samuel, did not approve. And he, with Susanna's approval, therefore sent Hetty away to work for a family in another town. Okay, you fell in love. We don't want you to marry this man. We arranged for you to go work in this other rich person's house, some other town. Well, Hetty was miserable. She didn't like the work. She was paid almost nothing. She wanted to be with the man she loved. She vowed never to return to her parents. But eventually she did return to her parents. And when she returned, they were absolutely aghast because she was pregnant. Not from this man, John Romilly, but from some other man. She was 5 months pregnant. And to make a sad situation worse, her parents, now Susanna, after a few years, forgave her daughter. Samuel never did. In fact, shortly after this, at one point, John, now as a preacher, preached a sermon in front of his father on, quote, showing charity to sinners. The siblings sided with Hetty. Not that they thought it was right that she was pregnant out of wedlock, but Dad, have mercy on sinners. And you can read some of the letters. They break your heart. Hetty says, I would take out my eye if I could just beg at your feet for forgiveness. And Samuel never did forgive her. Hetty, 28 now, she's not a little girl. 28, her father, okay, she's pregnant, so he marries her off to the very first person he can find, a plumber named William Wright. Hardworking, but an unlearned man given to drinking. And in time, his drinking became worse. Mary, one of the daughters, said this to her father. This is probably sadly true. She said to her father, "Oh, sir, you are a good man, but you are seldom kind and rarely just. You are a tyrant to those you love. And now in your tyranny, you are doing a downright wickedness." The wickedness was pushing Hetty completely out of their life. Some slight silver lining. When John started preaching, Hetty experienced a conversion, and she eventually became one of John's most trusted workers in the Methodist societies. The next child, Anne, we know little about. She married a land surveyor named John Lambert, seemed to have a normal life. John Wesley was number 7. Charles Wesley was number 9. We've looked at them. The 8th child, Martha, called Patty. She lived to be 85 years old, but also a difficult life. She also married poorly. It makes sense of all the Jane Austen novels and all the movies of are the daughters going to get married and what's it going to be like? And the father has sway over their lives in a way that would be foreign to most of us. Her husband, so this is Martha's husband, just to make things confusing, his first name was Wesley. Wesley Hall. Wesley Hall was a pastor, but he fell away from the Lord. When he was married to Martha, he seduced a seamstress who lived in their home. She became pregnant. Amazingly, Martha raised that child from an adulterous relationship her husband had, raised that child as her own. Martha had 10 children of her own, all but one of whom died in infancy. Eventually, her husband, Wesley, rejected Christianity. He became a deist and then an atheist, and then he eventually took another woman and sailed off for Jamaica. The 10th of the surviving children was Keziah. Now, before Martha, it's all very confusing, and we're almost done. Before, Martha married this man, Wesley Hall. He had professed his love for the 10th child, Keziah. And when he said, "I love you, Keziah," but he ended up marrying the sister Martha, it left Keziah heartbroken. She never recovered. She died at 32. You just go through all 10 of the children, and almost all of them had difficult marriages, not all, but the majority, some absolutely tragic circumstances. So come to the end of Samuel and Susanna's life. At the end of his life, Samuel Wesley was still trying to make ends meet. Now, this says a lot about his giftedness and also his supreme weakness. For 25 years, he was working on a scholarly Latin commentary of Job that he was convinced would be the great financial windfall in his life. I don't think there's ever been a time in the history of the world that a Latin commentary on Job was going to be the windfall. But he was convinced, honey, once my Job commentary gets out there. He had delusions of grandeur and never got published in his lifetime. And at the end of his life, Amelia said, one of his daughters, "My old belief yet remains that my father will never be worth a groat," small, a pittance. "And we of the female part of the family will be left to get our bread or to starve." He did have a better relationship with his sons, several of whom were in ministry, but it was strained when John and Samuel wouldn't take over the rectory at Epworth. After years of declining health, he died in 1735 at the age of 73. This left Susanna a widow for the remaining 7 years of her life. John saw to it that his father's Job commentary was finally published, and it fell to the earth with a great resounding nothing. John built, back in England, something called the Foundry. It was a converted factory, and it became a chapel. That's what they did because he wasn't in traditional parishes, so they built chapels. You know of a little town called Wesley Chapel, which dates to 1832 when Methodists came and built a Wesley Chapel there. So that on the outskirts here, south of town. So this was like a Wesley Chapel. They called it the Foundry. And when Susanna was a widow, she first lived with Amelia, then with Samuel, and finally with John. There was a little apartment there in the Foundry where she lived, and he was a good son to take care of her. So even though she was a benevolent despot, you can see, while the children had lots of frustrations with their father, they all seemed to deeply respect and love their mother and care for her. Now, coming to an end here, one of the strange things about Susanna's remarkable life is when exactly did she become a Christian? You might say, well, she was a Christian her whole life. She grew up in the church. She probably went to church every single Sunday. She taught the Bible to her kids. She read sermons for people. And yet, Charles thought she was only converted at the very end of her life. Remember this guy, Wesley Hall? This is a story of God's grace. Before he became an absolute scoundrel, he was leading communion. This was her son-in-law. And when he pronounced the words, "The blood of our Lord Jesus Christ given for thee," Susanna said, "It struck my heart, and I knew that God, for Christ's sake, had forgiven all my sins." And Charles said, "My mother had lived in a legal night for 70 years. Charles thought, my mother, all those years, was not really a Christian. Now, for the Lord knows. Was it to say she came to a better awareness? Or had she really been just pursuing a kind of works righteousness? But Charles said she came to know, and this legal night of 70 years was ended, and she lived the last 2 years of her life with a newfound joy and freedom. She died on July 23, 1742, at the age of 74. By every measure, a remarkable life. Remarkable in what she did and what she endured. It is a testimony to grace. All that has happened through this family. Maybe you're feeling a little better about your family. This is a family that needed a lot of grace. And Susanna needed it in her own life, and she probably didn't know it as well as she should have till the end. She was likely not the easiest mother to have, but she married an exceedingly difficult man. By our standards, her approach to childbearing might seem joyless, bordering on cruel, But on the other hand, she gave absolutely everything to her children. And all of them were a kind of force of nature like their mother. Strong, independent, opinionated, well-educated, and loved their mother, though they had deep frustrations with their father. She was caring, gifted, disciplined, hardworking, overbearing, harsh, sometimes more focused on work than grace, but always devoted to the pursuit of Christ and devoted with everything she had to her 10 surviving children. She was the mother of a remarkable family, and we can say she was the mother of the worldwide movement known as Methodism. Next week, Jonathan Edwards.